Hello, this is John Spink. I'm the director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. This is my presentation, Food Fraud Requirements and Trends for the Food Safety Summit here in Chicago on Thursday, May 11th, 2017. To begin, we're an academic institution and teaching is a big part of what we do. So first, review curriculum. You'll notice that this has Chinese characters there. And the key is that we partner with many people around the world, and one is the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment. And one thing we did with them is we took our massive open online concept and had it translated with captions into Chinese. It was captioned by the CFSA. This has become a training tool in China. First of the concepts that we have is an open course, massive open online course, free, open, and online, and it's exactly what it says. So anybody with access can participate in the course. The content is always free. There may be a fee for a certificate of completion or something, but the content is always free. And the first course we have is a food fraud overview. This is a two-session course. They're two one-hour webinars, live webinars. They're offered biannually in mid-May and mid-November. And actually here, the registration is open for our next session. The live lectures are May 18th and 25th. And then we've also developed a food fraud audit guide. So there's a lot of requirements, whether it's specifically GFSI to start, but FSMA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and others. And so we were asked for a curriculum to help guide both first-party audits, you to look at yourself, second-party audits being your internal auditors or someone you hire to come in and look at yourself, or third-party auditors for a certification. And that next one will be offered June 8th and 11th for the live lectures. We've already offered it once, and we'll also offer it in November. We conduct executive education or short courses. These are at Michigan State. They're a lot more intensive. They're 5 days usually total for the full program, and it has a lot more hands-on and one-on-one contact. So the first course is Food Fraud Management, which is the strategy and theories education, and the second is a vulnerability workshop. So over the course of a day, we go through a vulnerability assessment for your entire company. Also, the Michigan State University Food Safety Program is online, completely online. So we have graduate courses that are real MSU graduate courses, 3 credits offered online. The first is Anti-Counterfeit and Product Protection. This covers mainly food fraud, but some broader concepts that may impact your company. And then related courses we have are Quantifying Food Risk, Global Food Safety, Food Protection and Defense, Packaging for Food Safety. Now, if you've had a couple of these courses and you keep advancing, you feel the need, there's a certificate, a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. So these credits can be rolled into that certificate. It's an extra way to demonstrate your expertise and knowledge in this area. And if you're having a good time and the courses are working out for you, then you can roll those credits into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. This is a real Michigan State Master's of Science. It's real courses, real degree, real diploma, and it covers broadly food safety concepts. The presentation today is looking at full compliance. What is it? What do you need to do? And that includes food fraud and the vulnerability assessments. First off, the most urgent and hot topic is FSMA, specifically the Preventive Controls Rule. That's definitely the hot item. But beyond that, the goal is not for a company just to be PC compliant. It's to be compliant with all aspects of FSMA. So that's a broader concept. And that for food fraud, that could be the foreign supplier verification or accredited third party, all the other audits. And then really, though, the goal is not just to be FSMA compliant, it's to be compliant with all U.S. laws. That adds in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the adulterated food section and misbranded food section, as Dr. Ostroff from FDA will continually remind us, is still in effect, has been in effect, and it's really the core supporting FSMA as well. And then it's not just the food laws, it's all laws for the U.S. And that could be customs, tampering, and then financial, which is Sarbanes-Oxley. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Later there will be more and broader international food laws or codes, and that could include Codex or ISO, and I'll cover Codex in a minute. Commercial standards. So GFSI is the big one. That just had, in the end of February, their new requirements came out. We'll cover those. And on top of that, our customer requirements. If you're selling product to somebody, whether it's to a retailer or to a manufacturer, There may be specific requirements that they have for their products that add another layer of compliance. The objective is for you to be allowed to conduct business. And I'll say also that you don't commit a crime, so you're allowed to stay out of jail. Food risk matrix. So before going too much into food fraud, it's important to frame the concept for all of us. Food safety and food defense are well known, and they're common. You know, we've worked on these for a long time. When we were researching in this area and started to look at food fraud, we found that when we looked at prevention, trying to understand the root cause, it really didn't fit into food safety and food defense. It was fundamentally different from a prevention standpoint. So food fraud is a separate concept. Now, we add food quality in here not just to make it a pretty 2x2 matrix, but because most times quality management processes or programs or the function in a company are managed in these other areas. They all do work together in a broader continuum. The left column is unintentional. People do not try to create a food quality or food safety incident. On the right, food fraud and food defense are intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing, whether you catch them or not. For food defense, the intent is public health, economic, or terror. Now, key here is that there might be subcategories within food defense or within each of these cells, such as the FDA focus in FSMA, which is more wide-scale incidents such as terrorist attacks. That's very different than a disgruntled employee or casual tampering in a store, but all of food defense is protecting the product from anything intentional. And food fraud, the goal is economic gain. People are trying to make money for themselves and not get caught. A key with this food risk matrix is that for a company or a country, everything in this box must be addressed. And to be efficient, everything must be managed. So, again, even if for food fraud you're only looking at counterfeiting, that's only one piece of it. You have not covered everything. And the overall corporation, the board of directors, the C-suite, they have to manage everything. So if you're in charge of food quality, you might as well broaden your scope to everything that's required for your company. And we try to make sure to emphasize that we prevent by understanding the motivation, why this occurred. We're not trying to catch food fraud, we're trying to prevent it. Now, when we look at the difference between food safety and food fraud, with food safety, if the biological organism in question is a microbe, we would naturally go to the field of microbiology. That would be natural. We understand that. That's the science. But in food fraud, the biological organism in question is a human, so we'd go to social science, and specifically criminology. They've been studying situational crime prevention since the mid-'70s. There's literally thousands of articles on this. We can apply what we've learned in the other parts of crime science to food fraud. And so we want to understand the core problem before moving on to looking at countermeasures. And that core problem has to start with social science and the root cause, which is a human. So how do you go about looking at that overall problem first? You have to understand the overall vulnerability of the entire system, of that entire food risk matrix, before looking at countermeasures. If not, you're just kind of guessing. Now, then again, to say that if there was horse meat in beef, then maybe you'll do species tests for horse. But that doesn't stop a different type of fraud, a different type of beef species fraud occurring. You're stopping one specific thing, one point of entry, one type of crime. And really the goal is to prevent everything. So we do this by looking at the overall risk assessment. And risk analysis overall has this assessment, management, and communication, all very key in the process. So this is a corporate risk map, which would be defined in the financial or securities laws and regulations and practices. So a company or a country could have a corporate risk map for the entire country. So every type of fraud, every type of risk could be plotted on one chart. This is key because then we can judge where food fraud fits in relation to every other risk. If there are fires burning all around your town, you're not going to recommend that the fireman goes to a prevention exercise. And so you've got to understand that. There's technically a threshold here. And above the line is unacceptable, and below the line is a risk that's retained. It's just you set the priorities. So you've got to have this at first to be able to identify which types of fraud to address first, and end if that fraud issue is even a problem in relation to everything else at your company. There is no right answer for everybody. This is a risk appetite for your enterprise that fluctuates, and a fraud opportunity that's specific to your product. So the way we go about understanding what goes on that chart is a system, the food fraud prevention system. And the core is the fraud opportunity. This is situational crime prevention, and this is referred to as the crime triangle. And it's comprised of the victim, the fraudster, and the guardian and hurdle gaps. The area that we can work on the most is the guardian and hurdle gaps, things that we can control or monitor. The way that we understand the fraud opportunity is looking at three basic factors. One is a review of incidents. So there's incidents that you know of or incidents that you can research. There's databases or Google searches or other things to look at those incidents. Then there's horizon scanning. That's looking at things in the marketplace that may have changed or changing or vulnerable. That could be price swings, could be commodity shortages, other things like that. Just looking out proactively for things that are happening in the space. And public policy. A key with this is that if an agency says that they're going to start focusing on species tests, or a new regulation comes out, then that would change the focus in general, which increases the potential of that fraud opportunity being identified. And those all three combine to help us understand the fraud opportunity. And a key is in a dynamic nature, that if we keep looking at these review of incidents every so often, then we start to understand how that fraud opportunity changes. It is not static, it does change. Once we understand the fraud opportunity, we do what's first called an initial screen, or a pre-filter, a quick pass, just to see what it looks like. That's very, very much at the beginning, and that's what we want. We want to take this quick, complete view. You want to look at everything first, even though it's not very deep. And you look at it for all types of fraud. Because again, if you think about the food risk matrix, your company is vulnerable to all types of fraud. And one thing you might do if you go through this process, things like theft or diversion, maybe you'll identify very early that it is a low vulnerability for you. That's great. You've got a process that has defined a method to explain why you've identified it as a low vulnerability and why you're not doing anything about it. That's going to be key in a couple more slides. And then it connects to enterprise risk management. This is putting it on that corporate risk map. And that heat chart is something that the executives are used to looking at. That's their language, and they can understand how to assess whether this is bad enough. Now, if we look at the early initial screenings, it might not be that bad. The vulnerabilities might be within controls. So at that point, then, there wouldn't be a lot of additional assessment. We just don't know yet. But that's where that fits in. And we look at a risk rank. And that risk rank is both what might come out from a standard assessment, but also in relation to enterprise risk. Then we look at countermeasures very early, because if there are a few of those items that are in the unacceptable zone, above the line, in the red, then this is the best time to look at those countermeasures. And it might be to start doing species tests or something like that. And then we look at that back with a fraud opportunity, consider how that changes it, and then we do a more detailed vulnerability assessment. So there's a range here, and really the depth that's required is the depth that your resource allocation decision maker needs. And at that point, after that vulnerability assessment, we conduct the enterprise risk assessment again. And you'll notice here a cycle. It's a method and it's a cycle. And so over time, if the enterprise risks change, say the risk appetite of a company wants to be more aggressive or less aggressive, then that changes the whole dynamic. And on the left side, public policy, horizon scanning, and incident reviews, as there's new information there, that changes the fraud opportunity, and you go through the system again. An example is that when an incident occurs, let's say it's peanut allergens in cumin, that would be a review of incidents. That would feed into the fraud opportunity. A company would then review, did that new information, did that new incident fundamentally change the way we understand our fraud opportunity? And then you look in there at the changing fraud opportunity, and then you plug it into one of the vulnerability assessments to see if your vulnerability did change. And in some cases, there's a lot of controls in place, or suppliers that control of supply chains that for that maybe looking through this, that the fraud opportunity did not change. It stayed within the acceptable range. So at that point, you did review it, and you have a method to explain that even though there's a new incident, that it did not fundamentally change your risk profile. Boy, a big point that we're emphasizing a lot more is inspection or investigation. This is key. Inspection is for compliance. There's no active incident. the function is regulatory compliance or audit inspection. Did you do what you said you were going to do? And did you do what was required in a law or a standard? And what you're trying to do is convince an auditor or inspector that you meet the requirements. And you really just explain that the process is in compliance. So that's an inspection. The next is investigation, and we'll say it's not compliance, it's prosecution is the possibility here. There is an accident, an active incident, so let's say a baby just died. The function is legal liability or criminal investigation. That's very different than if you're looking just at compliance. And you want to present evidence to the investigator or prosecutor to prove there was no willful blindness or neglect. Those are very different. So here you're trying to explain why this incident was not a hazard that required a preventive control. Two things there, such as if we apply it to FSMA, the requirement is to identify hazards that require a preventive control. So there might be a lower threshold of evidence for how you determine that. For an investigation, again, an active incident, deaths, then there will be a lot more scrutiny in how you define this to not be a hazard that required a preventive control. To look at FSMA itself, we have a 15-page line-by-line excruciating detail of review of the preventive controls rule. Uniquely addressing food fraud or EMA that could lead to a public health hazard is a compliance requirement. You must do it. Now, what it doesn't do is explain exactly how or why you do it or how you do it. The rule only defines compliance to this rule. And the key with that is that there's other parts of FSMA and there's other laws such as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So even if something doesn't hit a threshold in FSMA, for example, horse meat in beef did not create a public health threat that would have been high enough to become a hazard that required a preventive control. That doesn't mean that horse meat in beef is legal, because it's still a violation of the adulterated foods or misbranded foods sections of FSMA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So basically, it appears that current broad food fraud vulnerability assessment and food fraud prevention plan activities will lead to compliance with FSMA PC, specifically looking at the requirements from GFSI, because GFSI is going to require you to conduct a vulnerability assessment. So you're looking across all products, all types of fraud, and then identifying the hazards that require preventive control. And if you find one, then you will address it. So it appears that GFSI will meet the compliance requirements. We have to say it appears because we don't have evidence of it being accepted or after an inspection yet anyway. Now, if you have questions on how it fits to the preventive controls rule, we have been presenting the Chapter 5 in the qualified individual training. We've been presenting the food fraud EMA aspects. So we have here some QR code links. We say all over them, you have copyright permission to use these anytime, anywhere. And I'm aware that they're used in the, as references or even played as videos in some of the current qualified individual training, and that's great. So that's what we're trying to do. So there's information there. Feel free to screenshot that and use it if you like. They're all available on YouTube and free. Now for GFSI, there's two main requirements. One is the food fraud vulnerability assessment. And what we have here is a documented food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure. It does not tell you what the procedure is. It doesn't tell you how many hours to spend on it. It doesn't tell you the scope or anything. It just asks yes or no. Do you have a documented, so written, food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure? The second is a food fraud mitigation plan. A documented plan, again, key, everything has to be documented. If there's a question, someone will come back and ask for your documentation. And then implemented to mitigate, so that's to prevent, the identified food fraud vulnerabilities. So in part one, you identify the vulnerabilities. In part two, you mitigate the public health risks there. Again, there's no limit or threshold of how much is enough, but it's the starting point. And then they went ahead and added another emphasis here that this food fraud mitigation plan shall cover the relevant GFSI scope. That is adulterant substances, it's tampering, it's stolen goods, it's counterfeits, it's gray market product, it's any product that has fraud of any kind. And so you can look deeper into the GFSI document or into the food fraud position paper by GFSI to look for more details. Codex Alimentarius, addressing food fraud. This is actually last week, that last Friday, when the final direction of the committee was approved. So Codex meeting was there, and they had a discussion paper on food integrity, food authenticity, food fraud. And in that paper, they looked at a wide range of things, specifically food fraud. And the results were that last Friday that the committee recommended to create an electronic working group to start to address this, and that EWG will work on definitions of food fraud and the other topics. Their belief was that when you start to define food fraud, it will define the scope of how you respond. That's excellent and important. Next is the definition of adulterant and adulteration. This is something in the U.S. that is very confusing, where an adulterated foods violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act might not have an adulterant substance in it. It could be spoiled goods. And so I think it will be important for Codex to address those definitions, to have clarity, Codex as a filter for the rest of the world to understand what we're talking about, and also to conduct gap analysis of current Codex texts. There's other parts of Codex, such as olive oil, honey, or others, that have some authentication components, testing components, and it would be important to look at those and see for harmonization of terms, but also how to connect them together. And then the step is when it's presented next year, the electronic working group will propose step 1 of the Codex formal process, which is to create a project which starts to develop that Codex text. The bottom line with Codex is that between GFSI, where it's already formal, it's in there, and now with Codex formally addressing food fraud, that food fraud is a part of the food compliance requirements. It's not going away. It will be a separate thing, very specifically addressed. And so between those, we're seeing a lot of clarity and consistency moving forward. Compliance for food fraud, to wrap it up. FSMA, preventive controls. Any agent that leads to a hazard that requires a preventive control, including an act that is economically motivated, is covered. Any types of fraud, all types of fraud, and all products. And the question will be, how do you define this to not be a hazard that requires a preventive control? For GFSI, that includes the schemes or standards that are involved. It covers all fraud, all products. It requires a vulnerability assessment and a prevention plan. Sarbanes-Oxley, we didn't cover this much, but these are financial requirements in the U.S. If you're a public company, your board of directors and the CEO, CFO are required to work on some or apply some specific methods to review the internal controls, financial controls of a company. And this is in relation to the value of the company, revenue, and part of that is referring to and assessing fraud. Anything that could change the revenue of the company. Just look at what's happened to some companies after they had some fraud incidents or food safety incidents. You'll see that their stock price can be greatly affected. Public company requirement is Sarbanes-Oxley, but even private companies, if there's no regulatory requirement, they still are conducting these ERM type reviews. Manage or disclose all threats to revenue. That's the key. You have to disclose them. And we've had some companies that realized they hadn't disclosed them or they weren't managed and they had to redo some of their work. And then Codex Alimentarius, the World Food Code. It's in process, and at 5+ years till it's a formal requirement. But the thing that's great is along the way we'll start to have some progress on more harmonized terms and definitions. The conclusion is conduct a vulnerability assessment for all fraud and all products. Just get started. That pre-filter is not hard to start. Begin the process, and there's a lot of resources out there, including ours, that can help you with that. There's a lot of ways to engage with MSU. Our graduate courses, we have executive education. The next ones will be mid-July, and we'll have them again in mid-September. And we do studies for different fields, multi-client studies if you like, and then we've got our series of MOOCs. So definitely keep looking for those as they come out. And with that, I'll say thank you to a lot of people. There's been a lot of support we've had, a lot of engagement, and really appreciative of a lot of people. With that, I'll say thank you.